Thanks for clicking enjoy the video. I barely had my coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Karen, the one with 3 kids and a knack for emergencies. I knew the drill. Karen's emergencies usually meant she'd forgotten an appointment, or her babysitter had bailed at the last minute. This time, the message was urgent. Karen, hey, please tell me you're free. Total emergency. You're my only hope. I looked out my window, her house only 2 doors down, and could already imagine her pacing the living room, phone in one hand and her toddler clinging to her leg. I sighed and started typing back. Me, hi. What's going on? She replied instantly, as if waiting for my response. Karen, can you babysit tonight? Just for a few hours, I'll pay extra. Promise I'll be back by 10. It was a Friday night. I'd had grand plans of catching up on homework, binge-watching a new show, and actually getting to bed at a reasonable hour. Babysitting, especially for Karen, wasn't exactly at the top of my list. But Karen wasn't just anyone in the neighborhood. She was a single mom, juggling 2 jobs, and trying her best to keep things together. She'd always been nice to me, and her kids, 10-year-old Timmy, 6-year-old Lily, and 3-year-old Max, were okay for the most part. Me. How long is a few hours? Karen, I swear it'll be quick. I'll be back by 10:30 at the latest. It's just a work thing. And I'll pay you double. I thought it over. Double pay wasn't bad. Plus, Karen would be back by a reasonable hour in theory. Before I knew it, I'd already sent my reply. Me, alright, I can be over by 5. Karen texted back a string of heart emojis, and before I knew it, I was grabbing my jacket, a book, and my charger, figuring I'd have a quietish night once the kids went to bed. I mean, how chaotic could a few hours really be? When I got to Karen's place, the chaos hit me like a wall. Toys were scattered across the entryway, and Lily, the 6-year-old, sprinted past me in some kind of superhero cape made from a towel, screaming, I'm a dragon queen. Timmy, the 10-year-old, was watching a prank video on his tablet, laughing with that look that always meant trouble, and little Max was carrying a toy hammer, pounding it against the couch cushions with all the intensity of a carpenter on a deadline. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Karen said, nearly out of breath as she shoved her purse over her shoulder. I swear I owe you big time for this. No worries, I said, though I was already scanning the room, wondering how I'd managed to wrangle them into bed by 8. So, any tips? Karen gave me a vague wave of her hand. Oh, they're easy. Just put them in front of a movie around 7, and they'll fall asleep before you know it. And Max just needs his teddy bear, or he gets a little fussy. She glanced at her phone, swore under her breath, and practically ran for the door. Call if you need anything, but I should be back by 10, promise. Before I could respond, she was gone. I took a deep breath, turning to face the 3 kids staring back at me. Timmy had a mischievous grin plastered across his face, and Lily was brandishing a plastic sword she must have fished out of the pile of toys on the floor. So, I said, who's up for a movie later? Timmy smirked. Movies are boring. Want to see my whoopee cushion collection? I spent the next few hours dodging Timmy's pranks, entertaining Lily's nonstop fantasy stories, and trying to keep Max from pounding every surface in sight with his toy hammer. At one point, Lily declared I was the royal babysitter and insisted I wear a paper crown she'd made, while Timmy kept sneaking fake bugs into my pockets, thinking he was a comedic genius. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, I was exhausted but relieved. I suggested a movie, and to my surprise, they all agreed without much resistance. Max snuggled into the couch with his teddy bear, Lily plopped down with her cape still wrapped around her shoulders, and Timmy finally stopped trying to trim me up with random pranks. For a brief moment, the house was actually peaceful. I checked the clock. 8:30 p.m. If Karen stuck to her word, she'd be home soon, and I could be on my way. But as 9 p.m. ticked by with no sign of her, I started to get an uneasy feeling. I texted her, asking if she was still on schedule, but got no response. I waited a few more minutes, then tried calling. Straight to voicemail. Another hour passed, and still no word from Karen. I glanced at the clock. 10 p.m. The kids were already asleep, sprawled out across the couch, and I was starting to get a little worried. I sent her another text, just a quick, everything okay? Nothing. I sighed, resigned to wait a little longer. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be as quick as Karen had promised. I kept checking the clock as the minutes crawled by, every tick feeling like an echo in the silence of the house. It was 10:30 p.m. now, and there was still no sign of Karen. My text sat unanswered, and every time I called, it went straight to voicemail. The kids were asleep, but Timmy and Lily had sprawled out across the couch, snoring in a way that was somehow both adorable and loud enough to be mildly disturbing. Max was curled up in an armchair, clutching his teddy bear in a death grip, looking surprisingly peaceful. I paced back and forth for a while, debating whether to call anyone. Karen hadn't left any emergency contacts, and I didn't know if she had any family in town. Finally, I figured I'd give it a little longer before totally panicking. To distract myself, I started tidying up. I picked up the toys, folded the superhero cape, and even washed a few dishes Karen had left in the sink. When I was almost done, I found an old pizza box on the kitchen counter, the lid barely closed. I peeked inside to see 2 slices left. My stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't eaten since dinner. I grabbed a slice, figuring Karen wouldn't mind, and then settled into an armchair with my phone. I scrolled mindlessly for a while, still watching the clock, and then noticed something strange. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement across the room. Timmy was sitting up, looking right at me. Did I scare you? He asked, a grin creeping across his face. I jumped, almost dropping my phone. Oh. No, I thought you were asleep, I said, catching my breath. He shrugged. I don't sleep much. That's when I do my pranks. But since you're here, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black spider, a realistic-looking one. Timmy, no more pranks tonight, all right? I said, trying to sound firm. Come on, he said, pouting but ultimately stuffing the spider back in his pocket. I was just about to relax again when my phone buzzed. I quickly checked the screen, hoping it was Karen, but it was a notification from one of my friends. 11:15 p.m. Still no word. I texted Karen again, this time a little more forcefully. Hey Karen, it's really late, and I have an early morning. Please let me know when you're on your way. I set my phone down, trying to shake off the anxiety that was starting to build. I'd babysat plenty of times, and sometimes parents ran late. But this late? Without a single word? It didn't feel right. Suddenly, I heard a small voice from the other side of the room. Can I get some water? Lily asked, rubbing her eyes and looking around sleepily. Of course, I whispered, grabbing a glass and filling it at the kitchen sink. When I handed it to her, she sipped slowly, staring at me over the rim of the glass. Mom's not coming back tonight, is she? Lily asked, almost as if she knew something I didn't. I was taken aback. Of course she is, I said, trying to sound reassuring. She'll be back soon. She's just a little late, that's all. Lily squinted, as if assessing whether to believe me. She said that last time too. Last time? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Yeah. She said she'd be back. But then she wasn't. Lily's eyes started to droop again as she curled back up on the couch, her little head resting on the armrest. She always says that, but sometimes she doesn't come home. Her words trailed off as she drifted back to sleep, leaving me staring at her in stunned silence. What was she talking about? Karen had mentioned she sometimes had work emergencies, but did she regularly leave her kids overnight? Another half hour passed, and it was officially midnight. I knew I had to make a decision. I texted Karen one last time. Karen, it's midnight. If I don't hear back from you in 15 minutes, I'll assume something happened and call someone. My message sat there, unanswered, as the seconds ticked by. I looked at the kids, all sound asleep again, and tried to decide if I should wake them or let them rest if I ended up needing to call the authorities. My stomach nodded at the thought, but I had to consider their safety. Finally, my phone buzzed. A message from Karen. Karen, sorry. Still tied up. Be back in the morning. We'll pay you double. I stared at the message, my mouth open in shock. She had just decided to leave her kids with me all night. No warning, no extra pay promised beforehand, nothing. Just a flippant text saying she'd be back in the morning like it was the most normal thing in the world. I replied immediately. Karen, I agreed to watch them until 10 p.m., not overnight. I have my own things to do tomorrow. No response. I took a deep breath and reread her message, practically seething now. It didn't seem like she'd been in a work emergency at all. In fact, the way she texted made it seem like she'd planned this all along. I sat back down in the armchair, half-heartedly scrolling through my phone, still fuming. And that's when I heard a sound I hadn't heard before, a strange scratching noise coming from the hallway. I looked up, my heart suddenly pounding. Turning on my phone's flashlight, I carefully made my way to the hall, listening as the scratching grew louder. My hands were shaking as I peeked around the corner, half expecting a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten in. But instead, there was nothing. Just an empty hallway, silent and dim. I took a step forward, my breath held, when suddenly Timmy's voice called out from behind me. Did you hear the monster too? He whispered. I whipped around to see him standing there, eyes wide and full of mischief. But this time, it didn't feel like a prank. What monster? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Timmy grinned, his eyes flickering with a gleam I couldn't quite place. Mom says it lives under the stairs, and it comes out when people stay too long. Timmy's words hung in the air, sinking into the quiet like a slow-moving chill. I blinked, trying to shake off the creeping dread. What are you talking about, Timmy? I asked, forcing a smile. There's no monster under the stairs. Timmy's expression didn't change. He just pointed down the dark hallway, his face lit up with a mischievous excitement. Mom says it comes out when people aren't supposed to be here, he whispered, his voice oddly serious. But only at night. Timmy, I said, forcing a laugh, you're trying to prank me again, aren't you? He didn't answer, just continued to stare at the staircase at the end of the hall, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. All right, time to get you back to bed, I said, steering him back toward the living room. He reluctantly let me guide him, but his gaze remained fixed on the hallway until we turned the corner. I settled him back onto the couch, making sure he was bundled up and comfortable. I checked on Lily and Max, too. Both of them still sound asleep, blissfully unaware of Timmy's stories. When I turned back, he was already dozing off, his eyes fluttering shut. I sighed, relieved that I'd dodged another prank, or so I thought. With everyone quiet again, I slumped back into the armchair, hoping to catch some rest myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling Timmy's words had stirred up. A monster under the stairs? Clearly, he was just a creative kid trying to mess with me. And yet, I couldn't help but think of the scratching sound I'd heard. Probably just an animal in the wall, I told myself, forcing a rational explanation. I scrolled mindlessly on my phone for a while, waiting for the kids' soft breaths to lull me into a sense of calm. But then, just as my eyelids were beginning to grow heavy, I heard it again. Scritch, scratch, faint but persistent, coming from the direction of the hallway. I froze, my eyes snapping open. I held my breath, hoping it was just the house settling or the kids shifting in their sleep. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to grow louder, more insistent, echoing in the quiet of the house. Curiosity and a bit of adrenaline got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and made my way toward the hallway once more. The light barely cut through the darkness, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. As I reached the staircase, I hesitated, feeling a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. "Come on," I muttered to myself. "It's just a noise. Nothing to be afraid of." I pointed my flashlight at the stairs, illuminating each step in turn. The noise had stopped again, leaving only the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The silence felt unnaturally heavy, almost pressing down on me as I reached the bottom of the staircase. And then, as I leaned in closer, I noticed something strange. One of the stairs, a narrow one near the bottom, had scratches along the edge, as if something sharp had scraped across it over and over. The paint was chipped and flaked, exposing old, splintered wood beneath. A shiver ran down my spine. "It's just the kids," I told myself, trying to stay calm. "They probably scratch things up all the time." But then I noticed something else, a faint, musty smell wafting up from beneath the stairs, earthy and damp. I hadn't seen a door under there, just a small crawl space with a dusty old vent. Before I could pull back, Timmy's voice spoke up behind me. "It likes to hide when it hears people coming," he whispered, startling me so badly, I nearly dropped my phone. I turned around to find him standing behind me again, his eyes wide and curious. "Timmy, I told you to stay in bed," I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't respond, just looked down at the space beneath the stairs. "Sometimes it scratches, like it's trying to get out," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Mom says if you hear it, you have to leave, or it'll come for you." "Okay, that's enough," I said, taking his hand and leading him back to the living room. "It's just your imagination, Timmy. There's no monster, all right." He didn't argue. Instead, he climbed back onto the couch without a word, lying down with a troubled look on his face. I watched him for a few moments, my nerves still rattling. "Good night, Timmy," I murmured, hoping he'd drift off and forget about this monster nonsense by morning. As he closed his eyes, I settled back into the armchair, pulling out my phone to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't quite right with Karen's house. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard a new sound, a quiet, rhythmic tapping coming from the staircase, almost as if someone or something was tapping its way down each step, one by one. The noise sent a chill through me, and I sat up, heart pounding. I turned my flashlight back toward the hallway, watching as the faint beam barely pierced the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it, each step growing louder and closer. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, unable to move, as the tapping came to a stop right at the bottom of the stairs. And then, silence. Just when I thought I might have imagined the whole thing, I heard it, a slow, drawn-out whisper that seemed to echo through the house, coming from somewhere in the dark. "Who is here?" I shot up from the armchair, heart racing, my gaze fixed on the hallway. The kids were still sound asleep, undisturbed by the sound, as if it was only meant for me. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't just leave them alone. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that I was just tired, that it was a trick of the mind, but that voice had felt real. I looked at the kids, huddled on the couch, and made a decision. I grabbed my phone, quickly typing out another message to Karen. "Karen, I need to know what's going on with your house. Please answer me." As I hit send, I glanced toward the staircase one last time, feeling the weight of something watching me, waiting just beyond the reach of a light. After sending the message to Karen, I sat in the dim living room, clutching my phone like a lifeline, my heart pounding. I'd never felt this level of unease in any house I'd babysat before, and Karen's cryptic absence only made things worse. Her refusal to answer any questions wasn't just inconsiderate, it was beginning to feel downright sinister. I checked the time. 1:30 a.m. Karen had said she'd be back in the morning, but I wasn't sure I could wait that long without some answers. The kids were still asleep, and I could hear their steady breathing over the strange silence that filled the house. I stood up, making my way into the hallway again. This time, I wasn't going to let shadows or strange sounds scare me off. I was going to get to the bottom of whatever was happening here. As I approached the staircase, I hesitated, remembering the scratches on the bottom step and that strange musty smell from the crawlspace vent. I shined my flashlight around, taking in the details. The scratches didn't look recent. They'd probably been there a while, but something about them unsettled me. They weren't the random scrapes of kids playing rough. They were deep, uneven, and deliberate, like something or someone had been clawing to get out. Taking a deep breath, I crouched down to get a better look at the vent under the stairs. The slats were grimy and half covered in dust, but the odd smell was definitely coming from inside. I reached out, hesitated, then unscrewed the cover, pulling it away to reveal a dark, narrow crawlspace, barely big enough for a small animal or a child. Just as I was leaning in to get a better look, I felt a sudden, icy draft sweep out from the crawlspace, chilling me to the bone. My flashlight flickered, and I pulled back, startled. The smell grew stronger, a mixture of damp earth and something else, something almost metallic. And then, my phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me back to reality. I scrambled to pull it out, hoping it was Karen. It was. Her message was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Karen, stay out of the basement. Whatever you do, don't open the door." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. The basement? I hadn't even realized there was a basement in this house. The thought of it sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Before I could respond, another message popped up. "Karen, I'll be back as soon as I can. Just keep the kids safe." My mind was racing. Keep the kids safe? Safe from what? Why had she never mentioned any of this before? If there was something dangerous in the basement, why would she have left the kids here with me in the first place? I quickly typed back, Karen, what's going on? What am I supposed to be keeping them safe from? But the message didn't send. I looked at my phone in frustration. No signal. Just then, I felt the temperature drop again, the cold seeping into the room. I hugged my arms around myself, glancing around, feeling more alone than ever. I heard footsteps, faint and soft, coming from the other side of the hallway. Turning around, I saw Lily, rubbing her eyes and looking sleepy. Are you okay? She asked, tilting her head to the side. I forced a smile, trying not to let my fear show. Yes, sweetie. Just checking something. She nodded, her eyes drooping again, and patted back toward the couch. I followed her, grateful for her company, even if she was half asleep. But as I guided her back to her makeshift bed, she looked up at me, her face serious in a way that seemed beyond her years. You don't go down there either, right? She asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. Down where's? She pointed to the hallway, her finger aimed right at the spot where I'd been crouched in front of the crawlspace. Mom says the basement is for people who don't listen, she said, a distant, almost rehearsed look in her eyes. People who don't follow the rules. My throat tightened. What rules, Lily? Lily's eyes fluttered shut, and she snuggled deeper into her blanket. Just don't listen if you hear it calling. It doesn't like when people listen. I wanted to ask more, but she drifted back to sleep, her tiny form curled up under the blanket. I sat back down in the armchair, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. The scratching sounds, the strange warnings, the monster Timmy had mentioned. Was it just the kid's imagination, or was there something really wrong with Karen's basement? Another wave of cold swept through the room, and I realized with a jolt that the door leading to the basement was just down the hallway, a few steps past the stairs. I'd only been in this house a handful of times, and Karen had never shown me that door. But now, I couldn't ignore it. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to sit back down and wait until morning when Karen would, hopefully, be back. But I couldn't help myself. I stood up, making my way down the hall, past the stairs, and stopped in front of the basement door. It was an old wooden door, chipped and slightly warped, with a tarnished brass doorknob that looked like it hadn't been turned in years. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the handle, when I noticed something strange. There were deep, uneven scratches along the wood, just like the ones on the staircase. And this time, they weren't faint. They were fresh. I leaned closer, heart pounding, and was just about to pull back when I heard it, a faint whisper from the other side of the door. Who is there? I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, as the whisper grew louder, filling the hallway, slithering into my mind like ice water. I bolted back to the living room, heart racing, as the whisper faded into silence. I wrapped myself in a blanket, clutching my phone tightly, and tried to stay calm, but I could still feel the echo of that voice. Who is theirs? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak, every groan of the house made me jump. I kept checking the kids, watching them as they slept peacefully, unaware of the nightmare unfolding around them. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window, and there was Karen, stepping out like it was just another morning. She walked in, saw me sitting there, and gave a tired smile. Thanks so much for staying. Sorry it was a late night. I stared at her, feeling anger and confusion bubbling up inside me. Karen, what was that about the basement? Why would you leave me here with? She raised a hand, cutting me off. I'm really sorry. I know it's hard to understand. I'll pay you extra. But please, just don't ask questions. It's better that way. I opened my mouth to argue, but something about her tone, flat, weary, almost resigned, made me stop. She handed me an envelope, filled to the brim with cash, and gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Thank you. Really. And if I ever ask again, just be sure to follow the rules, okay? Without waiting for an answer, she turned her back on me, as if that ended the conversation. I walked out of her house in a daze, gripping the envelope in my hand. I felt the weight of the cash, but it felt cold, tainted, like it came with a price I hadn't known I'd agreed to pay. As I left, I couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. Through the window, I saw the kids waving, their smiles warm and bright. But behind them, in the shadow of the hallway, I thought I saw something else, something watching, waiting. And as I turned away, I could have sworn I heard it again, the faintest whisper carried on the morning breeze. Who is theirs? As I drove away from Karen's house, the whisper seemed to follow me, lingering in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I'd barely escaped something terrifying. Despite every instinct telling me to leave it alone, I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I found out what was going on in that house. The next day, I sat in my tiny apartment, scrolling through every social media platform, looking up Karen's name. If there was any hint, any clue about her or her house, I was determined to find it. Unfortunately, Karen's online presence was sparse. Her profiles were practically empty, except for a few casual photos with her kids. But then I came across something that made my heart skip. An old local newspaper article from years ago. Headline: Family Tragedy Strikes in Local Suburb. The article was short, but it mentioned a couple who had lived in Karen's house before her. Their young son had gone missing. According to the story, he'd vanished one night without a trace. The police searched the house and surrounding area but found no leads, and eventually, the case went cold. I stared at the article, dread sinking into my stomach. A missing child, a family left broken. Was it connected to what I experienced in Karen's house? I couldn't be sure, but it felt like a piece of a larger, darker puzzle. That evening, I received a text from Karen. My heart leaped as I opened it, half expecting her to offer some explanation or apology. Instead, her message was brief, almost curt. Karen, are you available next weekend? Same rate as last time. I stared at the screen, a mix of shock and anger building inside me. After everything that had happened, she was asking me to go back, as if it were just a typical babysitting job. I took a deep breath and typed back a reply. Karen, I need to know what happened in your house. Why did you warn me about the basement? Why is your house? I hesitated, not sure how to phrase it. Haunted? Her response was immediate, almost as if she'd been waiting for the question. Karen, the house, it doesn't like to be disturbed, but it's harmless as long as you follow the rules. I stared at her message, feeling a chill run down my spine. Harmless? I thought of the whispers, the scratching sounds, the icy cold that seemed to emanate from the basement door. Whatever was in that house didn't feel harmless. It felt hungry. Karen, I can't do this again without knowing the truth. Please. I need answers. There was a long pause. Just as I was about to give up hope, another message appeared. Karen, fine. But you're not going to like it. A few minutes later, she sent me an address and a time. She wanted to meet, but not at her house. She'd chosen a small, nondescript coffee shop across town. It felt like a strange move for a simple conversation, but I agreed. The following day, I arrived at the coffee shop, my nerves buzzing. Karen was already seated at a table in the back, looking tired and haggard, her usually polished appearance noticeably worn. I sat down across from her, and we locked eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. Finally, she took a deep breath and began. It started with my grandmother, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. She lived in that house, but not by choice. Her family moved there when she was a little girl, and from what she told me, it wasn't long before they realized the house had moods. Moods. I echoed, leaning in. Karen nodded. Some nights, everything would be fine. But other times you could feel it. The house would change. Get colder. Darker. And that's when the rules started. My grandmother and her siblings learned them quickly. Don't go into the basement. Don't listen to the voices, and, most importantly, don't ever disturb the shadows. I shivered, remembering the shadow I'd glimpsed watching me through the window. But why not leave? I asked. Why stay in a place like that? Karen's expression turned sad. They tried, but every time they'd make plans to leave, something would go wrong. My grandmother's father lost his job, then his health. They couldn't afford to move. Eventually, they grew used to it, learned to live with the rules, and the house let them be, as long as they didn't break them. She looked down, tracing a pattern on the table with her finger. But then, one of my grandmother's siblings, the youngest, a little boy, started hearing the voices in the basement. He didn't follow the rules. Her voice faltered, and I saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. They found him at the bottom of the basement stairs. He was different. Cold. And his eyes, she stopped, swallowing hard. After that, they stopped going near the basement altogether. They locked it up and pretended it didn't exist. But my grandmother always told us the story, made sure we knew the rules. She called it the price of living there. A heavy silence fell between us. I swallowed, feeling the pieces of the story click into place. The voices, the scratching, the cold, it was all real. And Karen had grown up knowing this nightmare, accepting it as a family secret. So, why keep the house? I asked, struggling to understand. Why subject your kids to this? Karen looked away, her face drawn. It's not that simple. The house, it's tied to my family. We've tried selling it, even demolishing it. But every time, something stops us. The house always comes back to us one way or another. I shook my head, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. Karen, this is insane. You're putting your kids in danger. She looked at me with a desperation I hadn't seen before. I know, but we can't escape it. And as long as we follow the rules, we're safe. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. So, what about me? Why did you ask me to babysit? Why drag me into this? Karen hesitated, guilt flashing across her face. I needed someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't go poking around, but I was wrong to bring you in without telling you. I just thought maybe it wouldn't be so bad this time. The room seemed to close in around me, the weight of Karen's words pressing down. I could feel the darkness from her house creeping into my mind, the memory of that whisper echoing in my head. I stood up, feeling a surge of anger and fear. Karen, I'm sorry, but I can't keep doing this. You need to find a way to break free from that house for your kids' sake. She looked up at me, her expression almost pleading. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried. But the house, it doesn't let go. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, the cold air outside hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. And somewhere, just beyond the hum of city noise, I thought I heard a faint whisper. Who is there? I spent the next few days trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and Karen's house, but no matter what I did, it haunted me. I could feel it every time I closed my eyes, the cold grip of fear, the whispers creeping in, the shadows slinking closer. But even as I tried to shake the memories, I knew I couldn't leave it alone. There were too many questions, too many things left unexplained. I needed closure. I needed to know what was hiding in that house, and why it wouldn't let go of Karen and her family. Despite every rational voice in my head screaming at me to walk away, I found myself texting her. I'm coming back. But this time, I want answers. Her response was quick. Karen, come tonight. The kids will be with my sister. It'll just be you and me. As I pulled up to the house that night, the dread hit me like a wave. Even without the kids there, the place felt suffocating, the windows dark and lifeless. I steeled myself, took a deep breath, and walked up the path to the front door. Karen opened it before I could knock. She looked worse than I'd ever seen her, pale, with deep circles under her eyes. She didn't say a word, just gestured for me to come inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. The house's oppressive presence, as though it knew I was there. Karen led me into the living room and gestured for me to sit down. She took a shaky breath before speaking. "I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know everything about the house," she said quietly. "But I know enough to warn you, once you go down this path, there's no turning back." "What's really down there, Karen?" I asked, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. She looked away, as though gathering the courage to tell me something she'd buried for years. I think the house takes things. Memories, lives, time, it feeds on whatever it can. But there's something deeper, something it wants but hasn't found yet." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "And the basement." Karen's face twisted. "The basement is the heart of it. My grandmother always believed that whatever's in this house, whatever is the house, is strongest there. She called it the keeper. She said it knows when someone has entered its space, and it doesn't forgive easily." I didn't say anything, letting her words sink in. Then she handed me an old, tarnished key. "This is for the basement door. Once you go down there, you have to be careful. Don't let it sense your fear. And whatever you do, don't answer it if it speaks to you." I clenched the key in my hand, my heart pounding. But I knew I'd come too far to back out now. Without another word, I made my way down the hallway. The basement door loomed at the end, looking even more sinister in the dim light. I reached it, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into pitch darkness. A stale, earthy smell hit me, stronger than before, and I could almost hear a faint, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat. I took the first step, then another, feeling the cold deepen with each movement downward. As I descended, I felt like I was moving into a different world, one filled with shadows and silence. The walls felt damp, closing in on me as I reached the bottom step and found myself in a small, stone-walled room lit by a single bare bulb. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked around, taking in the strange, ritual-like symbols scrawled on the walls. But the worst part was the door. On the opposite wall, a second door stood, covered in deep scratches and dents, as though something had been trying to get through. It wasn't like the rest of the basement. It felt out of place, wrong, as though it didn't belong in the house but had been forced there. And I could feel it, even from across the room, a strange, ominous energy radiating from it. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something inside me needed to know what was on the other side. I reached out and touched the cold wood, feeling an electric jolt surge up my arm. Suddenly, the whispers started again, soft at first but growing louder, filling the room, swirling around me like a storm. "Who is there?" The voice was stronger now, more insistent, and it was coming from behind the door. My heart pounded as I tried to back away, but the door seemed to pull me closer, urging me to open it, to see. I could feel a darkness pressing against it, pressing against me, like a presence that had been trapped for centuries, growing hungrier with each passing moment. Then I heard a child's voice, faint but clear, as if it were right beside me. "Help me, please?" My hand froze on the doorknob, the voice sending a chill down my spine. It sounded so real, so desperate, but I remembered Karen's warning, "Don't answer it if it speaks to you." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to take a step back, breaking whatever spell the voice had cast. But then I heard it again, this time louder, more frantic. "Please, I'm trapped, help me." A wave of panic swept over me. I couldn't ignore it. It sounded like a child, like someone truly in need. But Karen's words echoed in my mind, a stark warning against whatever this was. And then, before I could make a decision, the door began to shake, the wood splintering as if something was trying to break through. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the whispers grew into a cacophony, voices overlapping, blending into one monstrous, desperate wail. "Let us out." I turned and ran, bolting up the stairs, the whispers chasing me, clawing at me with invisible hands. I could feel the darkness closing in, feel it wrapping around me, trying to pull me back into that basement. I didn't stop until I reached the top, slamming the door shut and locking it. I backed away, breathing heavily, as the whispers faded, leaving an eerie silence. Karen was standing in the hallway, her face pale and strained. She looked at me with a mix of understanding and fear. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, still catching my breath. "Karen, there's something trapped down there. It's real. I know," she interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. "That's why I told you to stay away. But now it knows you've been there." "What does that mean?" I asked, dread sinking into my stomach. Karen looked at me, her eyes hollow. "It means the house has seen you. And once it sees someone, it doesn't let them go." Her words hung in the air, filling me with a terrible certainty. I realized, in that moment, that I might never truly escape this house, that whatever was in that basement, whatever had been calling to me, had marked me. And as I left that night, glancing back one last time at the darkened house, I could have sworn I saw a shadow at the window, watching me go. Karen was standing in the hallway, her face pale and strained. She looked at me with a mix of understanding and fear. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, still catching my breath. "Karen, there's something trapped down there. It's real. I know," she interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. "That's why I told you to stay away. But now it knows you've been there." "What does that mean?" I asked, dread sinking into my stomach. Karen looked at me, her eyes hollow. It means the house has seen you. And once it sees someone, it doesn't let them go. Her words hung in the air, filling me with a terrible certainty. I realized in that moment that I might never truly escape this house, that whatever was in that basement, whatever had been calling to me, had marked me. And as I left that night, glancing back one last time at the darkened house, I could have sworn I saw a shadow at the window, watching me go. That was the last time I saw Karen or her house, or even heard from her. No one seems to know what happened to them, though rumors have spread in the town. Stories of families who've moved in, only to leave just as quickly, never quite the same. But I know the truth. The house isn't done with me yet. It never is.